Hey guys, welcome back. I really hope you are having a wonderful day, or a wonderful night, which, as always, is the statistically more likely scenario if you're here, getting comfortable, ready to let history wash over you for the next several hours. Tonight we're going to talk about something that is not ancient history. It is not medieval history. It is not even the kind of recent history that feels safely distant enough to be comfortable. Tonight we're going to talk about one of the most devastating economic and public health catastrophes in the history of the United States. A crisis that killed more Americans than the Vietnam War, that emptied towns, collapsed local economies, overwhelmed hospitals and prisons and foster care systems, cost the country trillions of dollars, and that was not a natural disaster or an act of war, but the deliberate product of decisions made by specific people in specific boardrooms and offices who knew what they were doing and did it anyway. We are talking about the opioid crisis, how it started, how it spread, who caused it, what it destroyed, and where it stands today. It is a story about greed, about regulatory failure, about the specific vulnerability of communities that had already been left behind, and about the long, slow, enormously expensive process of trying to repair damage that never had to happen. But before we begin, if you enjoy what I do here, please subscribe. It would genuinely mean everything to me, and leave me a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. I am always moved by how far these videos travel. Right, let us begin. Chapter 1. The patient, pain, medicine, and the world before OxyContin. You're in a doctor's office. The year is 1990, and the office is unremarkable. Fluorescent lighting, the particular smell of antiseptic and paper, a desk with a computer that is not yet connected to the internet, and a telephone that is attached to the wall. You're sitting across from your physician, and you are in pain. Real, persistent, daily pain. The kind that has been accumulating for months, that makes normal daily life difficult in ways that your doctor has been trying to address without complete success. Your doctor has options. They have anti-inflammatory medications, aspirin, ibuprofen, the various NSAIDs that manage mild to moderate pain with reasonable effectiveness and relatively manageable side effects. They have acetaminophen. They have for severe acute pain, post-surgical pain, cancer pain, end-of-life pain, opioid medications, morphine, codeine, hydrocodone in combination products. But for chronic non-cancer pain, the back pain, the arthritis, the fibromyalgia, the persistent pain conditions that affect large numbers of patients, without falling into the specific categories where opioid use was considered clearly appropriate, your doctor is cautious. The medical culture of 1990 regards long-term opioid use for chronic non-cancer pain with significant skepticism. The risk of addiction is understood as real. The evidence for long-term effectiveness is limited. The standard of care generally directs chronic pain patients toward non-opioid interventions, physical therapy, non-opioid medications, interventional procedures, and opioids are reserved for situations where the need is acute and the duration is short. This is not a perfect system. Chronic pain is genuinely debilitating, genuinely common, and genuinely undertreated in many cases. The skepticism about opioids for chronic pain, while grounded in legitimate concerns about addiction risk, sometimes produces situations where patients in genuine suffering are denied medications that could help them. The pendulum of medical opinion in 1990 is, arguably, positioned too far toward caution. There are patients who would benefit from opioid therapy and who are not receiving it. But the pendulum is about to swing, and when it swings, it will swing so far in the opposite direction, with such speed and such force, that the consequences will take decades to fully understand and will still be accumulating when this video is made. To understand what happens, you need to understand something about pain medicine as a specialty, and something about the specific historical moment of the 1990s in American medical culture. Pain medicine as an organized specialty was relatively young. The gate control theory of pain, the theoretical framework that explained how pain signals are processed and modulated in the nervous system, and that provided the intellectual foundation for thinking about pain as a medical condition requiring specific medical treatment, had been published in 1965. The idea that pain itself was a clinical problem requiring systematic medical attention, not simply a symptom of some underlying disease to be addressed by treating that disease, was still relatively new in mainstream medicine. In 1996, the American Pain Society launched a campaign to make pain the fifth vital sign. The existing 4 vital signs, blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, and temperature, were the basic physiological measurements that medical staff took routinely as indicators of a patient's overall health status. Adding pain as a 5th vital sign was a well-intentioned effort to ensure that pain was systematically assessed and treated rather than ignored or minimized. It meant that every patient encounter would include a formal assessment of pain, typically using a scale from 0 to 10, and that undertreated pain would be as visible as undertreated hypertension or fever. This campaign was not without merit. Pain really was undertreated in many clinical contexts. Cancer patients in the final stages of their disease were sometimes receiving inadequate pain management out of misplaced concerns about addiction in people whose life expectancy made addiction essentially irrelevant as a consideration. Post-surgical pain was sometimes managed more conservatively than the evidence supported. The push to take pain seriously as a clinical problem, to assess it systematically, and to treat it aggressively was not, in its origins, a bad idea. But the 5th vital sign campaign, and the broader cultural shift in American medicine toward aggressive pain treatment, created a demand, a genuine, measurable, institutionally validated demand for more effective pain medications. And into that demand, in 1996, a specific pharmaceutical company introduced a specific product that would change everything. The company was Purdue Pharma. The product was OxyContin. Chapter 2. The Sacklers. A family, a company, and a drug. You're in a boardroom. The year is 1995, and the executives and consultants gathered around the table are discussing a product that Purdue Pharma is preparing to launch. A new formulation of oxycodone, an opioid that has been in clinical use for decades in combination products at relatively modest doses. This new formulation is different. It is oxycodone in pure form, in doses significantly higher than those available in the combination products, delivered in an extended-release formulation designed to provide 12 hours of continuous pain relief. The extended-release mechanism is the product's key selling point. Traditional opioid formulations deliver their effect quickly and wear off quickly. They require multiple daily doses. They produce peaks and troughs of drug concentration in the bloodstream that patients experience as fluctuating relief, and they create the conditions for the classic cycle of dependence in which the wearing off of the drug feels like a return of pain rather than the normal experience of a medication's effect ending. The extended-release formulation, which releases its oxycodone content gradually over 12 hours, is supposed to avoid these problems: steady blood levels, continuous pain relief, fewer doses per day, and it is supposed to be safer in terms of addiction risk than immediate-release formulations. This claim, the claim that the extended-release mechanism reduces addiction potential, will prove to be one of the most consequential pieces of marketing in the history of American pharmaceuticals. Because Purdue Pharma's sales force will take this claim, and a body of evidence that was far thinner and far more contested than the marketing materials suggested, and use it to persuade thousands of American physicians that OxyContin was safe to prescribe for chronic non-cancer pain in ways that the existing medical culture had been cautious about opioids generally. The Sackler family, the family that owned Purdue Pharma, was not a newcomer to the pharmaceutical industry. Arthur Sackler, who died in 1987 before OxyContin was developed but whose influence on the pharmaceutical marketing industry shaped the approach that Purdue would use, had essentially invented the practice of direct-to-physician pharmaceutical marketing in the 1960s. Arthur had built his fortune partly through a medical advertising agency that pioneered the techniques of persuading physicians through advertising and sales representative relationships to prescribe specific medications, techniques that were and remain controversial in the medical community, but that proved extraordinarily effective commercially. The OxyContin launch employed these techniques at scale, and with a specific focus that reflected Purdue's understanding of where the market opportunity lay. The target was physicians who treated chronic pain, the primary care doctors, the family practitioners, the internists who saw patients with back pain and arthritis and fibromyalgia, and the various other conditions that produce chronic pain in large numbers of patients. These were not oncologists or palliative care specialists, the physicians who had been using opioids for cancer and end-of-life pain for years, but the general practitioners who had been cautious about opioids for chronic non-cancer pain. Purdue's sales force, which grew to over 900 representatives by the early 2000s, was trained and incentivized to promote OxyContin for exactly this population. They visited physicians with gifts and meals and educational materials. They promoted the drug's 12-hour duration. They promoted the claim that the extended-release formulation made it less prone to misuse than immediate-release opioids. They promoted data from a study that would later be extensively criticized for its methodology and its conclusions, suggesting that addiction rates among patients receiving opioids for chronic pain were very low. That study, a 1980 letter published in the New England Journal of Medicine by Herschel Jick and Jane Porter, reporting that addiction was rare among hospitalized patients receiving opioids for pain, has become one of the most consequential pieces of research in the history of the opioid crisis, not because of its findings, but because of how those findings were used. The letter was a 5-sentence note about hospitalized patients who were under medical supervision, receiving opioids for acute conditions in controlled settings for short periods. It said nothing about chronic pain patients receiving opioids over months or years in outpatient settings, but it was cited, repeatedly and with mounting frequency through the 1990s and 2000s, as evidence that opioids were not addictive when used for pain, a claim that went far beyond anything the letter's authors had intended or the data could support. The 1996 launch of OxyContin was accompanied by a marketing campaign of unusual intensity. Purdue held regional conferences for physicians, invited speakers who promoted aggressive pain treatment, and created materials, including a video called I Got My Life Back, featuring patients who attributed their restored quality of life to OxyContin, that presented the drug's benefits in emotional and compelling terms. The campaign worked. OxyContin sales grew from approximately $48 million in 1996 to nearly $1 billion in 2000. By 2010, Purdue had collected more than $30 billion in OxyContin revenue, and across America in the communities where OxyContin was prescribed, a crisis was beginning to build that no one, or rather, many people who were ignored by those with the power and the financial interest to act, could see coming. Chapter 3. Appalachia First. The geography of devastation. You're in a small town in West Virginia. The year is 1999, and the town is, like many towns in this part of the country, dealing with the accumulated consequences of economic decline that has been building for decades. The coal mines that once employed the men of this region have been closing steadily since the 1970s, victims of a combination of technological change, competition from cheaper coal in other regions, and the beginning of a longer-term energy transition that has not yet produced any clear economic alternative for the communities that depended on coal. The manufacturing jobs that might have provided an alternative are gone too, moved south, moved overseas, victims of the same broad economic forces that have been hollowing out working-class employment in rural America for a generation. What remains is a population that is by any economic measure significantly disadvantaged relative to the national average. Higher rates of poverty, lower rates of educational attainment, worse health outcomes, less access to economic opportunity, and that is also in ways that will prove relevant to the crisis that is about to descend on it. Geographically isolated, socially tight-knit, and significantly underserved by the medical and social support infrastructure that wealthier regions take for granted. The specific vulnerability of Appalachia to the opioid crisis is not coincidental. It reflects the intersection of several factors that, in combination, created conditions in which opioid addiction could spread with a speed and a completeness that devastated entire communities before the scale of the problem was fully understood. The first factor was the concentration of manual labor occupations, coal mining, logging, construction, that produced high rates of physical injury and chronic pain. Men and women in these occupations genuinely had pain, real pain from real injuries, from years of physically demanding work in conditions that were not always safe and that were not always managed with the attention to long-term musculoskeletal health that occupational medicine has since developed. When OxyContin arrived, it arrived in communities with genuine, unmet pain treatment needs. Communities where the Fifth Vital Sign campaign's observation that pain was undertreated was empirically correct. The second factor was the specific geography of pharmaceutical distribution in this region. Pill mills, pain clinics that prescribed opioids with minimal diagnostic rigor, operated by physicians whose prescribing practices were not carefully monitored by regulatory authorities, proliferated in Appalachia in the late 1990s and early 2000s, serving both local patients and patients who drove significant distances specifically to obtain prescriptions. The regulatory oversight of prescribing practices was minimal in this period. The Drug Enforcement Administration's prescription monitoring programs were limited. State prescription drug monitoring programs were either non-existent or non-functional, and the combination of high prescribing rates and minimal oversight created conditions in which enormous quantities of opioids flowed into these communities with essentially no effective barrier. The third factor was the specific social network structure of tight-knit rural communities. Once opioid dependence established itself in a community, it spread through social networks in ways that reflect the specific sociology of rural communities, where everyone knows everyone, where families are extended and interconnected, where the social mechanisms that might limit drug use in more anonymous urban settings do not operate in the same way. A person who became dependent on OxyContin would share pills with family members, with friends, with neighbours. The drug would move through social networks with a speed that reflected the density and trust of those networks. The fourth factor was the specific pharmacology of OxyContin as it was being used. The extended-release formulation that was supposed to make OxyContin safer than immediate-release opioids had an Achilles heel, one that was discovered quickly by people who were motivated to find it. If you crushed the tablet and snorted the resulting powder, or dissolved it in water and injected it, the extended-release mechanism was defeated. The full dose of oxycodone that was supposed to be released slowly over 12 hours was delivered all at once, producing an intense rush of euphoria that immediate-release formulations at lower doses could not match. Purdue was aware of this vulnerability. Internal documents subsequently revealed in litigation showed that company officials had knowledge, early in the drug's commercial history, that OxyContin was being crushed and misused. The company's response to this knowledge, which was to continue marketing the drug aggressively while taking limited and belated steps to address the misuse problem, is one of the most damning elements of the subsequent legal narrative. In the communities of Appalachia, OxyContin misuse spread through a pattern that has since been documented extensively. Patients who were prescribed the drug for legitimate pain began to recognize its euphoric properties. Some shared their prescriptions with family and friends. The practice of obtaining prescriptions from multiple physicians, doctor shopping, spread as people sought to maintain their supply. The prescription drug monitoring systems that might have identified and interrupted this behavior were not yet in place or not yet functioning effectively. By the early 2000s, the consequences of this spread were visible in the mortality statistics of Appalachian states. West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, states that had been economically distressed before OxyContin arrived, were now experiencing overdose death rates that were beginning to diverge sharply from national averages. The bodies were being counted. The connection to opioid prescribing was being made by public health researchers and by local health departments and by county coroners who were seeing the same cause of death over and over in communities that were not equipped to understand or respond to what was happening. The federal response to these early warning signs was inadequate in ways that would be extensively analysed in the years that followed. The FDA had approved OxyContin's label with language about its abuse potential that was less emphatic than the clinical evidence warranted. The DEA's enforcement actions against pill mills were slow and limited. The pharmaceutical industry's lobbying presence in Washington was substantial, and the political will to take aggressive regulatory action against a legal pharmaceutical product, one that was generating significant tax revenue, that had genuine medical uses, and that was being marketed with the full apparatus of pharmaceutical industry persuasion, was limited. The crisis that began in Appalachia was not contained there. It spread. It spread geographically, following the distribution networks of both pharmaceutical opioids and the street heroin that would eventually replace them when prescription opioids became harder to obtain. It spread socially, following the networks of people, ideas, and substances that connected rural Appalachia to the broader American landscape. And it spread demographically, eventually affecting communities of every kind, rural and urban, wealthy and poor, white and black and Latino, in ways that made the initial characterization of the opioid crisis as a rural, white, working-class phenomenon progressively less accurate as the years passed. Chapter 4. The Pill Mills. Medicine as an Assembly Line. You're in a parking lot in eastern Kentucky. The year is 2003, and the parking lot belongs to a pain clinic. The clinic is not particularly large, a converted commercial space, with a waiting room that is currently full of people who have driven from multiple counties away. some of them from across the state line. The wait is several hours. Nobody in the waiting room appears to be particularly unwell in the way that patients in a typical medical office appear unwell. Some of them are accompanied by people who will drive them home. Many of them appear to know each other, or to be from the same communities, or to be part of the same social networks. The atmosphere in the waiting room has a specific quality, not the anxious, suffering quality of a genuine pain clinic, but something more transactional, more purposeful, more organised around a specific expected outcome. Inside, the physician, or the physician's assistant, or whoever is conducting the consultations today, is seeing patients at a rate that does not allow for thorough diagnostic evaluation. The consultation is brief, a complaint of pain is documented, a prescription for OxyContin, or hydrocodone, or another opioid is written. The patient returns to the waiting room, collects the prescription, and leaves. The next patient enters. The rate of turnover is such that the clinic sees dozens of patients in a day, each paying cash for their consultation, each receiving a prescription whose medical necessity has not been rigorously established, each adding to the river of opioid pills flowing into the surrounding communities. This is a pill mill, the informal name for the pain clinics that proliferated in certain states during the early 2000s, operating at the boundary between legitimate medical practice and pharmaceutical distribution, exploiting the specific vulnerabilities of a regulatory environment that had not kept pace with the scale of the opioid prescribing explosion. The pill mill was not a new concept in American drug history. The basic model of a physician providing prescriptions for controlled substances with minimal medical justification had precedents in the histories of previous drug crises. But the specific conditions of the early 2000s opioid boom, the cultural shift toward aggressive pain treatment, the availability of high-dose pharmaceutical opioids through legitimate prescription channels, the limited development of prescription monitoring systems, and the enormous profit available from high-volume prescribing of expensive medications made the pill mill a business model of extraordinary financial attractiveness. The economics were straightforward. OxyContin prescriptions, filled at a pharmacy with insurance coverage, produced medications that had significant street value, as much as $1 per milligram on informal markets, meaning that a bottle of 30-80 milligram OxyContin tablets was worth approximately $2,400 on the street. The cash consultation fee at a pill mill was modest, $30, $50, $100. The prescription itself was the product. The physician providing it was in effect providing pharmaceutical distribution services under a medical license. Some of the physicians running pill mills were knowingly engaged in what was, by any reasonable interpretation, a criminal enterprise. Others occupied a grayer zone, genuinely believing that they were providing a medical service to underserved patients with legitimate pain needs, while the specifics of their practice, the cash payment requirement, the volume of patients, the minimal diagnostic workup, placed them in a category that the DEA and state medical boards would eventually define as outside the boundaries of legitimate medical practice. Florida became the epicenter of the pill mill crisis in the mid-2000s, for reasons that reflected the specific regulatory environment of that state. Florida had no prescription drug monitoring program, no state database tracking who was receiving prescriptions for controlled substances from which physicians, which meant that doctor shopping was essentially undetectable. Florida had a specific statutory structure that made it relatively easy to open pain clinics with minimal regulatory oversight. And Florida's geography, a large population spread across a wide area, with significant tourism and seasonal population movement, made the tracking of pharmaceutical diversion difficult. By 2010, Florida had approximately 98 of the top 100 oxycodone dispensing physicians in the United States. Pills distributed from Florida pill mills were being transported to Kentucky, West Virginia, Ohio, and other states in quantities that had no relationship to any legitimate medical need. The phenomenon of pill tourists, people making the drive from Appalachian states to Florida specifically to obtain prescriptions from pill mills, had become sufficiently well established that it had acquired a nickname, the OxyContin Express. The quantity of opioids being distributed through both legitimate and illegitimate channels in this period was staggering. The DEA's own data, subsequently analysed in congressional investigations and court proceedings, showed that 76 billion oxycodone and hydrocodone pills were distributed in the United States between 2006 and 2012. 76 billion pills in a country of approximately 310 million people. That is roughly 245 pills for every man, woman and child in the country over that 6-year period, a number so far removed from any plausible medical necessity that it raises immediate and obvious questions about where these pills were going and how they were being distributed. The answers to those questions, the investigation of the specific distributors, the specific pharmacies, the specific manufacturers who were aware of the quantities flowing through their supply chains and continued to distribute anyway, would become the basis of some of the largest civil litigation in American legal history, producing settlements that ran into the tens of billions of dollars and that we'll discuss in detail in a later chapter. Chapter 5. The Economics of Addiction. What the crisis cost and who paid you are looking at a spreadsheet. This is not, admittedly, the most cinematic moment in a story that contains many dramatic moments, but the spreadsheet matters, because the opioid crisis is not simply a public health catastrophe, not simply a story of individual suffering multiplied across millions of lives. It is also an economic catastrophe of staggering dimensions, and understanding the economic dimensions is essential to understanding why the crisis was allowed to develop to the scale it did, why the response was so inadequate for so long, and what the long-term consequences for American prosperity are going to be. Let us start with the direct costs, the costs that can be measured directly in dollars spent on responses to the crisis. Healthcare costs are the most immediate. The treatment of opioid overdose is expensive. An emergency department visit for a non-fatal overdose costs thousands of dollars, and the repeated overdose visits that characterize the trajectory of opioid use disorder add up rapidly. The administration of naloxone, the overdose reversal medication that has become standard in emergency response, costs money. The treatment of opioid use disorder, whether through medication-assisted treatment or residential rehabilitation or outpatient counseling programs, costs money. The long-term healthcare costs of people who survive overdoses but suffer lasting neurological or cardiovascular damage cost money. The criminal justice costs are equally substantial. The arrest, prosecution, incarceration, and supervision of people whose criminal activity is driven by opioid dependence, the thefts, the drug offences, the various other crimes that addiction generates, runs through the criminal justice system at every level, generating costs that fall on local governments, state governments, and the federal government simultaneously. The building and staffing of expanded jail and prison capacity to house people whose incarceration is related to the opioid crisis is a capital and operational expenditure that communities have been making for years. The child welfare costs are significant and deeply human. The opioid crisis has driven an enormous increase in the number of children entering foster care. As parents with opioid use disorder lose the capacity to safely care for their children, Child Protective Services agencies across the country have seen caseloads explode in ways that their budgets and their staffing were not designed to accommodate. The cost of foster care placement is substantial. The cost of neonatal abstinence syndrome, the condition of babies born to mothers who used opioids during pregnancy, who go through withdrawal after birth and require extended hospital stays, adds directly to healthcare costs. The lost productivity costs are the largest single category of economic damage, and they are the hardest to measure directly because they represent what did not happen rather than what did. People who die of opioid overdoses are mostly working-age adults. They are not dying at the end of a long lives after careers of economic contribution. They are dying at 35, at 40, at 50, removing from the workforce people who had decades of productive work ahead of them. People who are living with opioid use disorder but not yet dead are often not working, or working at significantly reduced capacity, producing an ongoing drag on economic output that accumulates over years. The economists who have attempted to quantify the total economic cost of the opioid crisis have produced numbers that vary widely depending on the methodology and the time period covered, but they consistently arrive at figures in the hundreds of billions of dollars per year. A 2017 analysis by the Council of Economic Advisers estimated the total economic cost of the opioid crisis in 2015 alone at approximately $504 billion, accounting for healthcare costs, criminal justice costs, lost productivity, and the statistical value of lives lost. A 2019 study in JAMA Network Open estimated the cumulative economic burden between 2001 and 2017 at $1.02 trillion. Other estimates are higher. These are not simply numbers. They represent the accumulated economic capacity of the United States being consumed by a crisis that did not have to happen. That was the product of specific decisions made by specific actors whose financial interests in creating the crisis were aligned against the interests of the communities that bore its costs. The geographic distribution of these costs is deeply unequal, and understanding the geography of cost is essential to understanding the political economy of the crisis and its response. The communities that bore the most acute costs of the opioid crisis, the rural Appalachian counties, the deindustrialized Rust Belt towns, the economically distressed communities across the country where opioid death rates were highest, were also the communities with the fewest resources to respond. County governments with tax bases devastated by economic decline were being asked to fund expanded emergency medical services, expanded jail capacity, expanded child welfare services, expanded addiction treatment infrastructure, all at the same moment that the crisis was reducing their tax base further by removing working-age adults from the workforce. The fiscal capacity mismatch, the gap between where the costs fell and where the resources to address them existed, is one of the most important structural features of the opioid crisis as an economic event. The pharmaceutical companies that generated the profits from OxyContin were not located in West Virginia. Their shareholders were not disproportionately affected by the consequences of their products. The costs were externalized, displaced onto the communities, the governments, the healthcare systems, the families that were downstream from the decisions that generated the profits. Chapter 6. The Regulatory Failure. How the system that should have stopped this did not. You are in Washington. The year is 2001, and in the offices of the Food and Drug Administration, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, and the various other federal agencies whose mandates touch on pharmaceutical regulation and drug enforcement, people are doing their jobs. They are processing applications, reviewing data, conducting inspections, writing reports, attending meetings. The machinery of federal regulation is running, and a crisis of historic proportions is building in American communities, and the machinery is not stopping it. The regulatory failure that allowed the opioid crisis to develop to the scale it did is not a simple story of corruption, or of intentional neglect, or of a single decision that could have been made differently and avoided everything that followed. It is a more complicated and in some ways more disturbing story, a story of institutional limitations, of regulatory capture, of the specific difficulties that arise when a powerful industry with sophisticated lobbying capabilities encounters a regulatory system that was designed for a different era and a different scale of pharmaceutical marketing. The FDA's approval of OxyContin in 1995 included language on the drug's label that stated, incorrectly, as subsequent analysis has shown, that the delayed absorption of the extended-release formulation was believed to reduce the abuse liability of the drug. This language, which Purdue Pharma's sales force would use extensively in their marketing as evidence of FDA endorsement of OxyContin's safety profile, was based on an inference rather than clinical evidence. The FDA approved it anyway, and it remained on the label until 2001. The FDA's relationship with the pharmaceutical industry during this period was shaped by the Prescription Drug User Fee Act of 1992, which established a system under which pharmaceutical companies pay fees to the FDA to fund the review of their drug applications, with the understanding that the FDA will meet specified review timelines. This arrangement, which created a financial relationship between the regulating body and the regulated industry, has been extensively criticized as creating structural pressures toward approval and away from the more cautious, time-consuming review processes that might have caught problems earlier. The DEA's enforcement capacity against pharmaceutical diversion, against the pill mills, the doctor shoppers, the illegitimate distribution networks that were moving prescription opioids from the medical system into informal markets, was limited by staffing, by legal complexity, and by the inherent difficulty of distinguishing legitimate from illegitimate prescribing without the prescription monitoring data that most states had not yet developed. The DEA identified oxycodone as a drug of concern in the late 1990s and took some enforcement actions against pill mills and individual physicians, but the scale of enforcement was inadequate relative to the scale of the problem. The prescription drug monitoring programs, the state databases that record prescriptions for controlled substances and allow physicians, pharmacists, and regulators to identify doctor shopping and other patterns of misuse, were, in the early 2000s, present in only a minority of states, and in those states where they existed, they were often not mandatory, not real-time, and not interoperable with neighbouring state systems. A person doctor shopping across state lines, obtaining prescriptions from multiple physicians in multiple states, could do so without triggering any alert in any system, because no system existed that could see the complete picture of their prescribing history. The lobbying that Purdue Pharma and other pharmaceutical companies conducted during this period was sophisticated and effective. Industry lobbying helped to delay the implementation of mandatory prescription drug monitoring programs in several states. Industry lobbying shaped the development of pain treatment guidelines in ways that promoted opioid prescribing. Industry funded medical education, the conferences, the continuing medical education courses, the speakers' bureaus that paid physicians to deliver pro-opioid prescribing messages to their colleagues, shaped the medical culture around pain treatment in ways that regulatory officials had limited visibility into and limited authority over. The specific failure of Congress to respond to early warning signs of the crisis, the reports from the Government Accountability Office, the testimony of public health researchers, the death statistics that were accumulating in state health departments by the early 2000s, reflects the specific political economy of pharmaceutical regulation. The pharmaceutical industry's campaign contributions to congressional candidates were substantial. The industry's employment of former congressional staffers and regulatory officials in lobbying and public affairs roles was extensive. The political will to take aggressive action against a legal industry that was generating significant economic activity and employing large numbers of people was, for most of the first decade of the crisis, limited. The DEA, in 2005 and 2006, developed an internal analysis suggesting that the quantities of oxycodone being distributed by wholesale distributors to specific pharmacies were far in excess of any plausible legitimate medical need. This analysis, which identified specific distributors and specific pharmacies that were apparent hubs in the diversion network, did not produce timely enforcement action commensurate with the scale of the problem it identified. The reasons for this: the legal complexity of proving that a distributor knew its products were being diverted, the resource constraints on DEA enforcement operations, the specific legal standard required to take action against a DEA registrant, are the subject of extensive subsequent analysis and litigation. The congressional hearing that would eventually produce the most devastating documentation of regulatory failure came in 2017, when the Washington Post and CBS News published the results of a joint investigation revealing that Congress had, in 2016, passed legislation, the Ensuring Patient Access and Effective Drug Enforcement Act, that significantly weakened the DEA's ability to take emergency action against pharmaceutical distributors suspected of facilitating diversion. The legislation had been championed by the pharmaceutical industry's lobbyists, had passed with bipartisan support, and had been signed by President Obama. The DEA's own administrator, Joseph Ranazzisi, who had been the agency's most aggressive advocate for strong enforcement action against the distribution industry, had opposed the legislation and was subsequently pushed out of his position. The regulatory failure of the opioid crisis is, in summary, a story of institutional limitations that were exploited by sophisticated commercial interests, operating at a scale and with a persistence that the regulatory system was not designed to counter. It is not a story of simply evil regulators doing bad things. It is a story of a system designed for one set of conditions being operated in a very different set of conditions, with consequences that the people inside the system could see accumulating and could not stop. Chapter 7. The Transition. From pills to heroin. You're in a living room in Ohio. The year is 2010, and the person sitting on the couch has been using OxyContin for 3 years. It began with a prescription, a legitimate prescription, for a legitimate injury, from a physician who was following the pain treatment guidelines of the era, and who genuinely believed that the medication was appropriate and relatively safe. The prescription ran out. The injury healed mostly, but the dependence did not heal with it. The person found ways to obtain more, from other physicians, from friends, eventually from informal markets where pharmaceutical opioids circulated at prices that reflected their street value. And then, in 2010, something changes. Purdue Pharma, under pressure from regulators, reformulates OxyContin. The new formulation is abuse deterrent. It turns into a gel when crushed rather than a powder, making it significantly harder to snort or inject. The pharmaceutical opioid that has been the anchor of this person's dependence becomes simultaneously harder to obtain and harder to use in the way that their dependence requires. The price on the informal market rises, the availability falls. What does not change is the dependence. the neurological adaptations that months or years of opioid use have produced in this person's brain, the changes in receptor density, in reward circuitry, in the neurological machinery of craving and withdrawal, do not reform when the pill does. The need remains, the supply is disrupted, and into that gap, with a price and an availability that the pharmaceutical market can no longer match, comes heroin. This is the transition that public health researchers have documented as one of the most consequential single developments in the opioid crisis. The shift, in the early 2000s, from prescription opioids to heroin as the primary drug of dependence for a significant portion of the people whose opioid use disorder began with pharmaceutical products. The mechanism is straightforward in the logic of addiction economics. Heroin is significantly cheaper than pharmaceutical opioids on the street. It is pharmacologically similar enough that it satisfies the same neurological need, and it becomes more available in the communities most affected by pharmaceutical opioid dependence as drug markets respond to the demand created by that dependence. The demographic profile of heroin use in America changes in ways that are historically unprecedented. Heroin had, for most of the 20th century, been primarily an urban drug, associated with particular urban neighborhoods, particular demographic communities, carrying the specific stigma of the street addict that distinguished it, in the cultural imagination, from the pain patient with a prescription. The opioid crisis demolishes this distinction. The people transitioning from pharmaceutical opioids to heroin in the early 2000s are not following the demographic patterns of previous heroin epidemics. They are suburban, they are rural, they are white. They are people whose entry into opioid dependence came through a doctor's office and a prescription, and whose transition to heroin is a desperate economic adaptation rather than a cultural or social choice. The public health consequences of this transition are severe. Heroin, unlike pharmaceutical opioids, has no standardized dose. A pharmaceutical tablet contains a precise, labeled quantity of oxycodone or hydrocodone. A bag of heroin contains an unknown quantity of an unknown purity of a drug that varies in potency from purchase to purchase. Overdose, in this context, is not simply a consequence of using too much. It is a nearly unavoidable consequence of using a product whose potency is unknown and whose consistency cannot be guaranteed. The people transitioning from pharmaceutical opioids to heroin are accustomed to the predictability of pharmaceutical products. The unpredictability of the street market is, for many of them, lethal. The overdose death rate begins to climb in ways that the previous plateau of pharmaceutical opioid deaths had not prepared public health officials to expect. In states already devastated by pharmaceutical opioids, West Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, heroin overdose deaths begin to appear in the mortality statistics in significant numbers by 2012 and 2013. The total drug overdose death rate, which had been rising steadily through the 2000s on the back of pharmaceutical opioid deaths, begins to accelerate. This acceleration is visible in the communities, experiencing it in ways that go beyond mortality statistics. Emergency departments report increasing numbers of overdose visits. Police departments report increasing numbers of overdose calls. The infrastructure of community response, the emergency medical services, the hospital emergency departments, the crisis hotlines, the treatment systems, begins to show the strain of a demand that it was not designed to meet and that is increasing faster than it can be addressed. In some communities, the response generates moments of dark policy discussion that illustrate how badly overwhelmed the systems are. Fire departments in some Ohio cities begin to debate policies for limiting the number of times they will respond to overdose calls for the same individual. Not because anyone genuinely believes this is sound public health policy, but because the volume of calls is consuming resources at a rate that is compromising their ability to respond to other emergencies. The discussion itself, the fact that it is happening, that it is being had in good faith by people trying to manage impossible resource constraints, is a measure of the scale of what the communities are facing. The transition to heroin is not the last transition in the opioid crisis, it is the second wave. The third wave is coming, and it will be worse. Chapter 8. Fentanyl. The third wave. You're in a chemistry laboratory, not a pharmaceutical one, not the kind of clean, regulated facility that produces medications under FDA oversight. A clandestine one, probably located in China or Mexico, probably operated by people with no particular concern for purity standards or consistency of dosing or the safety of the eventual users of the product being manufactured. The product being produced is fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that was developed in 1960 for use in medical anesthesia that is approximately 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine, and that has, since the mid-2000s, transformed the American opioid crisis from a devastating epidemic into something that public health officials have run out of adequate adjectives to describe. Fentanyl's appearance in the illicit drug supply is a consequence of the same economics that drove the transition from pharmaceutical opioids to heroin. Fentanyl is extraordinarily potent. A dose measured in micrograms, invisible to the naked eye, is sufficient to produce the effect of a much larger quantity of heroin or pharmaceutical opioids. This potency means that fentanyl is extraordinarily easy to smuggle. A kilogram of fentanyl, small enough to fit in a shoebox, represents enough doses to supply a very large drug market. The cost per dose for the producers is a small fraction of the cost of heroin or pharmaceutical opioids. The profit margins are enormous. From the perspective of the drug supply chain, fentanyl is a more attractive product than heroin in almost every economic dimension. It is cheaper to produce. It is easier to transport. It produces a stronger effect per unit of weight. The only significant disadvantage, and it is a catastrophic one for the people consuming it, is that its extreme potency makes accurate dosing essentially impossible in a clandestine manufacturing and distribution system that has no quality control. Fentanyl begins to appear in the American drug supply in significant quantities around 2013 and 2014. Initially, it appears primarily in the heroin supply, mixed into heroin by dealers who are either trying to boost the potency of their product or who are simply cutting heroin with whatever is cheapest and most available, without particularly caring about the consequences for the users who cannot tell what they are consuming. Later it appears in counterfeit pharmaceutical tablets, fake OxyContin, fake Xanax, fake Adderall, manufactured to look like legitimate pharmaceutical products but containing fentanyl instead of or in addition to the labelled active ingredient. The overdose death rate, which had been rising through the pharmaceutical opioid and heroin waves, accelerates dramatically once fentanyl establishes itself in the drug supply. The number of overdose deaths in the United States in 2015 is approximately 52,000. By 2017 it is approximately 70,000. By 2021 it is approximately 107,000. A number that exceeds the peak annual death toll of every previous drug epidemic in American history, that exceeds American combat deaths in Vietnam, Korea and Iraq combined. That is, if you allow yourself to sit with it for a moment, simply staggering. The specific toxicology of the fentanyl crisis produces deaths in ways that differ from the pharmaceutical opioid wave in important respects. Pharmaceutical opioid deaths were often slow, the result of escalating doses over time, of the gradual development of tolerance that led people to take more than their bodies could safely process. Fentanyl deaths are often sudden, the result of a single dose of unknown potency in a person whose tolerance is not high enough to survive it, or in a person who has lost tolerance after a period of abstinence and returns to use at their previous dose level, not understanding that fentanyl in the supply has made that calculation lethal. Naloxone, the opioid overdose reversal medication, remains effective against fentanyl overdose, but the speed of fentanyl's respiratory depression means that the window for intervention is shorter than with heroin or pharmaceutical opioids. A person who overdoses on fentanyl may lose consciousness and stop breathing within minutes. The presence of a bystander who recognizes the overdose and has access to naloxone, and who acts immediately, can save that person's life. The absence of any one of those conditions means the person dies. The expansion of naloxone access, the policy efforts to make naloxone available without prescription in pharmacies, to distribute it through harm reduction organizations, to train community members to recognize and respond to overdoses, becomes one of the most important and most contested public health interventions of the fentanyl era. Contested because naloxone access sits at the intersection of public health evidence and moral and political debates about harm reduction that reflect deep divisions in American culture about addiction, responsibility, and the appropriate role of government in managing the consequences of drug use. The fentanyl wave also changes the geography and demography of the crisis in ways that complicate the political and policy response. While the first wave of pharmaceutical opioids disproportionately affected white rural and working-class communities, producing a political framing of the opioid crisis as a crisis of those communities specifically, the fentanyl wave has spread into every demographic and geographic category. Black Americans, who had lower rates of pharmaceutical opioid overdose partly because they were less likely to be prescribed opioids in the first place, experience rapidly rising fentanyl overdose death rates in the mid-2000s and 2020s. Urban communities that had not been epicenters of the pharmaceutical opioid crisis find themselves facing the fentanyl crisis in full force. This demographic broadening has complicated the political response to the crisis. The specific political attention and sympathy that the opioid crisis attracted in its early phases, attention that was shaped in part by the perception that it primarily affected white working-class communities, has been difficult to sustain as the crisis has become more demographically diverse, and as the fentanyl supply has made it clear that no community is protected by any demographic characteristic. Illicitly manufactured fentanyl analogues, chemical variations on fentanyl's basic molecular structure, produced to evade drug scheduling laws, have added further layers of complexity and lethality. Carfentanil, a fentanyl analogue used in veterinary medicine to immobilize large animals, is approximately 10,000 times more potent than morphine. Its appearance in the illicit drug supply in some markets has produced mass casualty events, situations in which multiple people overdose simultaneously, overwhelming the capacity of emergency medical services to respond. The third wave is not over. It is ongoing, and understanding how the country has attempted to respond to it, and how inadequate that response has been relative to the scale of the crisis, requires understanding not just the public health dimensions, but the legal and economic battles that have been fought over who is responsible for what has happened, and what they owe the communities that have borne the cost. Chapter 9. The Lawsuits, Holding the Industry Accountable. You're in a courthouse. The year is 2019, and the number of opioid-related lawsuits pending against pharmaceutical manufacturers, distributors, and pharmacies runs into the thousands, filed by states, by counties, by cities, by Native American tribes, by hospitals and health insurers, by school districts and pension funds, by essentially every category of public institution that has been able to construct a legal theory connecting its financial damages to the conduct of the pharmaceutical industry. The legal theory underlying most of these suits is not complicated in its basic structure. The pharmaceutical manufacturers, Purdue Pharma most prominently, but also Johnson & Johnson, Endo Pharmaceuticals, Allergan, Mallinckrodt and others, are accused of deceptive marketing, of misrepresenting the safety and addiction potential of their opioid products in ways that caused physicians to prescribe them inappropriately and in quantities far exceeding any legitimate medical need. The pharmaceutical distributors, McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, Cardinal Health, the three companies that together distribute approximately 90% of the nation's pharmaceutical products, are accused of failing to maintain the suspicious order monitoring systems required by federal law, of knowing that the quantities of opioids they were shipping to certain pharmacies and certain regions were far beyond any plausible legitimate medical use, and of shipping those quantities anyway. The factual basis for these accusations is substantial. The litigation has produced an extraordinary volume of internal corporate documents, emails, memoranda, marketing materials, sales data, internal analyses, that provide a detailed, contemporaneous record of what the pharmaceutical companies knew, when they knew it, and what they decided to do about it. The documents are, in many cases, damning in ways that go beyond what the external record had previously suggested. Internal Purdue Pharma documents reveal a company that was aware of the abuse potential of OxyContin from very early in the drug's commercial history, that tracked reports of abuse and diversion with care, and that responded to those reports primarily by developing strategies to protect the drug's commercial position, rather than by taking substantive action to address the public health consequences. Documents show Purdue sales representatives receiving bonuses tied to the volume of OxyContin prescriptions generated in their territories, a direct financial incentive structure that aligned the company's employees with the maximization of prescribing regardless of medical appropriateness. McKesson's internal documents and the documents of the other major distributors show companies that received regular reports from their own suspicious order monitoring systems, from DEA compliance staff, from pharmacists and others in their distribution networks, of orders that were anomalous in ways that should have prompted inquiry and in many cases refusal to ship. The documents show compliance personnel raising concerns that were overridden by sales leadership. They show discussions of the legal requirements for suspicious order monitoring that reflect a legal and compliance function more focused on managing regulatory risk than on actually preventing diversion. Purdue Pharma's bankruptcy filing in 2019, a strategic bankruptcy, designed to use the federal bankruptcy process to consolidate the thousands of pending lawsuits against the company into a single negotiated resolution, produced the most extensive public airing of the company's internal conduct. The bankruptcy proceedings revealed the full extent of the Sackler family's wealth extraction from the company, approximately $10 to $12 billion removed from Purdue in the years before the bankruptcy, transferred to family members in ways that place those funds beyond the reach of the company's creditors, including the governmental entities suing it for damages. The resolution of the Purdue Pharma bankruptcy was contested, overturned on appeal, and renegotiated multiple times, a legal saga that stretched across years and that ultimately produced a settlement in which the Sackler family agreed to pay approximately $6 billion to the Resolution Fund, while receiving a release from personal civil liability for conduct related to the opioid crisis that the family's members were accused of directing. The propriety of that liability release, the question of whether a bankruptcy proceeding could properly shield the Sackler family members, who were not themselves bankruptcy filers, from civil suits by the public entities whose communities had been damaged by the company's conduct, was the subject of Supreme Court review and produced one of the most consequential decisions in bankruptcy law in recent decades. The settlements reached with other pharmaceutical companies, Johnson & Johnson, the major distributors, the pharmacy chains, added additional billions to the resolution funds. The total value of pharmaceutical opioid settlements reached with state and local governments exceeded $50 billion by the mid-2020s. It is the largest civil litigation resolution in American history, exceeding even the tobacco settlements of the 1990s in total value if not in per capita terms. The money, when it arrives in state and local governments, comes with strings. Most of the major settlement agreements require that the funds be used for opioid abatement, for treatment, for prevention, for recovery support services, for the specific interventions that the public health evidence identifies as effective in reducing opioid-related death and disability. This restriction is deliberate. It reflects the experience of the tobacco settlements, a significant portion of whose proceeds were diverted by state governments into general fund uses that had nothing to do with the health consequences of tobacco use. The opioid settlements, having learned from that experience, attempt to ensure that the money goes to the purpose for which it was won. Whether it will be enough, whether $50 billion distributed across thousands of communities over many years will be adequate to address a crisis that has already cost more than $1 trillion and is still generating costs at a rate of hundreds of billions annually, is a question that the arithmetic makes it difficult to answer optimistically. Chapter 10. The communities that were left. What addiction does to a place you're in a county in West Virginia. The statistics for this county are available in the public health databases, and they tell a story that statistics are not supposed to be able to tell. A story with weight and texture and specificity. A story of a place rather than a number. The overdose death rate in this county is several times the national average. It has been elevated for more than 20 years. In some years, during the worst of the pharmaceutical opioid wave, the county lost more people to overdose than to every other cause of death combined except cardiovascular disease. There are families in this county who have lost multiple members, siblings, parents and children, cousins who grew up together, to the same crisis, to the same drug, within years of each other. There are grandparents raising their grandchildren because the middle generation is gone, dead or incarcerated or so consumed by their addiction that they cannot function as parents. There is a generation of children growing up with neonatal abstinence syndrome histories, with the specific neurological and developmental challenges that early opioid exposure can produce, with the specific childhood experiences of loss and instability that parental addiction generates. The social infrastructure of these communities has been reshaped by the crisis in ways that go beyond mortality. Trust, the social trust that allows communities to function, that underlies the informal networks of mutual support and economic cooperation through which people navigate daily life, has been damaged. When addiction is widespread, theft increases. When theft increases, social trust decreases. When social trust decreases, the informal mechanisms of community life, the willingness to help a neighbour, to participate in community organisations, to invest in local institutions, become harder to sustain. The labour market consequences are visible in the employment data. Labour force participation rates in heavily affected counties have fallen significantly. not simply because people have died, but because people living with untreated or inadequately treated opioid use disorder are often not working. Employers in these regions report difficulty filling positions, not because the positions do not exist, but because the pool of applicants who can pass drug testing and maintain reliable attendance has been reduced by the prevalence of addiction. The economic development consequences of this labour market tightening are not academic. Companies deciding where to locate new facilities include workforce quality in their calculations, and regions with high addiction rates and low labour force participation are at a disadvantage in those calculations. The property markets of severely affected communities show specific patterns. Abandoned houses, the physical residences of people who have died, who have been incarcerated, who have left the community because there is nothing to stay for, accumulate in ways that depress property values, reduce municipal tax bases, and create physical environments that accelerate the social decline they reflect. The blight of abandonment is both a consequence and a cause of the community deterioration that the opioid crisis drives. The healthcare infrastructure in these communities has been strained in ways that extend well beyond the direct costs of opioid treatment. Rural hospitals, already financially fragile before the crisis, because they serve populations that are disproportionately elderly, uninsured, and Medicaid-dependent, have faced the simultaneous challenges of increased demand for addiction-related services and reduced ability to pay for them. Rural hospital closures have accelerated during the opioid crisis era, leaving communities not only without addiction treatment resources, but without the broader healthcare infrastructure that serves all of their health needs. The school systems of heavily affected communities show the downstream consequences of family disruption in the educational outcomes of children raised in addiction-affected households. Children with parents in active addiction are more likely to miss school, more likely to exhibit behavioural problems that affect their learning and their classroom environment, more likely to drop out before completing their education. The educational pipeline that communities depend on to develop the human capital for future economic activity has been disrupted in ways that will take generations to fully repair. The faith communities, the churches and religious organizations that have historically been among the primary social support institutions in rural American communities, have been responding to the crisis in ways that have both exhausted their resources and transformed their understanding of their mission. Pastors conducting multiple funerals per year for people dead of overdose. Food pantries expanding to serve families destabilized by addiction. Recovery ministries forming to address the treatment gap that the formal healthcare system cannot close. The faith community response is genuine and significant and chronically underfunded relative to the scale of what it is attempting. This is what the opioid crisis looks like from the inside of a community, not as a statistic, not as a policy problem, not as a line item in a settlement negotiation, but as a daily lived reality that shapes every dimension of community life, and that accumulates year over year into a transformation of place that the people who grew up in these communities did not choose and could not have anticipated. Chapter 11. Treatment. What works, what doesn't, and why the gap is so large you're in a treatment centre. The year is 2015, and the centre is doing the best it can with the resources it has, which are not sufficient for the demand it is facing. The waiting list for residential treatment is weeks long. The outpatient programme has a caseload that exceeds what the staff can manage with the clinical attention the evidence suggests is needed. The medication-assisted treatment programme, the programme that provides buprenorphine or methadone, the medications that reduce craving and withdrawal, and that decades of clinical evidence have demonstrated to be the most effective available treatment for opioid use disorder, has a capacity that serves a fraction of the people in the community who need it. The treatment of opioid use disorder is one of the areas where the gap between what the science says and what the policy provides has been most consequential in the history of the crisis. The scientific evidence for medication-assisted treatment, specifically for buprenorphine and methadone, is robust, consistent, and has been accumulating for decades. Patients who receive medication-assisted treatment have dramatically lower rates of overdose death, dramatically higher rates of treatment retention, dramatically better outcomes on essentially every measure that matters than patients who receive abstinence-only treatment or who receive no treatment at all. Despite this evidence, medication-assisted treatment has faced substantial cultural and political resistance throughout the opioid crisis. The resistance takes several forms. the abstinence-only treatment community, the tradition of recovery that holds that sobriety means freedom from all substances, including medications, and that views medication-assisted treatment as substituting one addiction for another, has significant cultural influence in the American recovery community and has shaped the policies and practices of treatment programs in ways that have delayed the adoption of evidence-based medication-assisted approaches. The stigma that attaches to methadone in particular, a medication that is dispensed only at licensed clinics under regulatory restrictions that reflect its history of being associated with treatment of heroin addiction in urban communities, has limited its accessibility and acceptability in communities where the stigma of seeking treatment at a methadone clinic is itself a barrier. Buprenorphine, which can be prescribed by any physician with a specific DEA waiver and dispensed through standard pharmacies, has a somewhat better public image than methadone, but has faced its own regulatory barriers. The requirement that physicians obtain a specific waiver to prescribe it, a requirement that was eliminated by legislation in 2023, limited the number of providers who could prescribe it and created specific access problems in rural areas where the number of waivered providers was small relative to the population in need. The prescribing limits that the waiver system imposed, initially capped at 30 patients per physician, later raised but still limited, further constrained the supply of buprenorphine treatment in heavily affected areas. The result of these cultural, regulatory and resource constraints is a treatment gap of enormous dimensions. Various analyses have estimated that fewer than 20% of people with opioid use disorder in the United States receive any form of specialized treatment, and the proportion receiving the evidence-based medication-assisted treatment that offers the best outcomes is smaller still. People who want treatment cannot access it. People who are motivated to change cannot find a program that can serve them. The waiting list, the simple, devastating fact of the waiting list, produces deaths among people who sought help and were told to wait. The specific inadequacy of crisis detoxification as a standalone intervention deserves emphasis because it is a mode of treatment that has been widely deployed and is largely ineffective for opioid use disorder. A brief detoxification, the management of withdrawal symptoms over several days in a medical setting, can successfully get a person through the acute phase of physical withdrawal from opioids. What it cannot do is address the persistent neurological changes that opioid use has produced, the craving that continues long after acute withdrawal is complete, or the social and psychological factors that drive continued use. The vast majority of people who complete detoxification without transitioning into ongoing medication-assisted treatment return to use, rapidly, often within days, because the detoxification has reduced their tolerance while doing nothing to reduce their craving. The specific danger of this return to use, a person whose tolerance has been reduced by even a brief period of abstinence returning to use at their previous dose, with fentanyl in the supply making accurate self-assessment of dose impossible, makes the post-detoxification period one of the highest risk windows for fatal overdose. People are dying because they got the wrong kind of treatment, not because they got no treatment. This is not an abstraction. It is measurable in the mortality data of the populations that cycle through detoxification programs. The expansion of naloxone access, the distribution of the overdose reversal medication to community members, to people who use drugs, to the friends and family members of people with opioid use disorder, has saved lives in measurable quantities. Studies in multiple states have documented the mortality reduction associated with naloxone access programs. The lay administration of naloxone by bystanders, by people who are not medical professionals, but who have been trained to recognize overdose and administer the medication, has become one of the most effective public health interventions of the fentanyl era. The harm reduction framework, the approach to addiction policy that prioritizes keeping people alive and reducing the immediate harms of drug use over demanding abstinence as a precondition for assistance, has expanded its presence in the American policy landscape during the opioid crisis. Needle exchange programs which reduce the transmission of HIV and hepatitis C among people who inject drugs have expanded despite persistent political resistance. Naloxone distribution programs have expanded. Fentanyl test strips, which allow people who use drugs to test their supply for the presence of fentanyl before using it, have been adopted as a harm reduction tool despite being classified as drug paraphernalia under the laws of many states. The harm reduction debate in America reflects the same deep cultural and moral divisions about addiction that have shaped the policy response to the crisis throughout. For those who believe that addiction is primarily a moral failure and that harm reduction enables and encourages drug use, any intervention that reduces the consequences of drug use without demanding abstinence is objectionable. For those who believe that addiction is primarily a medical condition and that keeping people alive is a precondition for any other form of recovery, harm reduction is simply good public health practice applied to a specific population. This debate is not resolved, it is ongoing, and its outcome, which interventions get funded, which approaches get implemented, which populations get served, continues to shape the mortality statistics. Chapter 12. The Faces Behind the Numbers. Individual stories of the crisis. You're not in a boardroom or a courthouse or a regulatory office. You're in a kitchen in rural Pennsylvania. It is 6 a.m. A woman in her late 50s is making coffee, moving through the routine of the morning with the careful, deliberate pace of someone who has learned not to let her mind run too far ahead of the present moment. On the counter, next to the coffee maker, are 2 framed photographs. One is of her daughter, taken at a birthday party, laughing, holding a child on her lap. The other is of a little boy, about 7 years old, who goes to school from this house every morning, who sleeps in the bedroom at the end of the hall, who calls this woman Grandma. The daughter in the photograph died of an overdose in 2018. She was 31 years old. The little boy is her son. This woman, his grandmother, is raising him, has been raising him since he was 4, has reorganized the entire structure of her life at an age when most people are beginning to think about what retirement might look like, to provide stability and continuity for a child whose parents could not provide it. There are approximately 2.7 million children in the United States being raised by grandparents because their parents are unable to care for them. The opioid crisis is not the only driver of this number, but it is a significant one. And the experience of grandparent caregivers, invisible in most policy discussions, carrying an enormous and largely unsupported burden, is one of the dimensions of the crisis that the mortality statistics and the economic models do not capture. In a clinic in Huntington, West Virginia, a city that became briefly famous as a center of the opioid crisis, and that has since become equally famous as a center of community response to it, a nurse practitioner named Sarah has been prescribing buprenorphine for 6 years. She started doing it because nobody else in her area was doing it at the scale the need demanded. She has seen people who are days from death stabilize on medication and rebuild their lives. She has also seen people she treated for months die of overdoses in the periods between appointments, or after leaving treatment, or after a relapse that came without warning. She has learned to hold both of those realities, the recoveries and the losses, in a way that allows her to keep coming to work. She says that the thing people outside the addiction treatment world do not understand is how long recovery takes. Not weeks, not months, years, sometimes decades. A person might cycle in and out of treatment multiple times before finding the stability that allows sustained recovery. Each cycle is not a failure, it is a part of the process. But the public and the policymakers want a narrative of treatment that looks like acute illness. You get sick, you get treated, you recover, you move on. Addiction does not work that way. The infrastructure for supporting people across years and decades of recovery does not exist at the scale required, and the political will to build it has been limited by the persistent desire for a simpler narrative. In a county in eastern Kentucky, a man named James, 53 years old, 18 months in sustained recovery, working at a recovery community organization helping others navigate the treatment system he once navigated himself, talks about what he needed to get to where he is. Not one thing, not a single intervention or a single moment. A medication that stopped the cravings at a biological level. A counselor who did not shame him. A job that hired him despite his record. A place to live that was stable and safe. A community of people in recovery who understood what he was experiencing without needing it explained. The removal of any one of those elements, he says, and he is not certain he would have made it. This is the ecosystem of recovery, the combination of medical, social, economic, and relational supports that research has consistently shown to be necessary for sustained recovery from opioid use disorder. Building that ecosystem in communities that have been devastated by the crisis, communities that may have limited healthcare infrastructure, limited employment opportunities, limited affordable housing, limited social cohesion, is not a simple public health intervention. It is a project of community reconstruction that runs parallel to the medical treatment of individuals, and that requires a scale of investment and a duration of commitment that the policy response has not yet consistently provided. The faces behind the numbers are not statistics. They are people who got a prescription from a doctor they trusted, or who grew up in a household where addiction was already present, or who self-medicated a depression or a trauma that nobody had treated, or who made a choice in a moment of pain or boredom or peer pressure that cascaded into something they did not foresee and could not easily escape. The moral complexity of their situations, the interplay of individual choice, structural condition, neurological vulnerability, and corporate exploitation resist the simple narratives that public discourse tends to prefer. They deserve more than simple narratives. Chapter 13. The Political Economy of the Crisis. Who responded, and how you are in Washington again. The year is 2016, and the opioid crisis has, finally, after 2 decades of accumulating mortality statistics and community devastation, become a political issue of the first order. Presidential candidates are discussing it. Congressional hearings are being held. The specific communities most affected, the rural white working-class communities of Appalachia and the Rust Belt, are politically salient in ways that connect their suffering to the electoral calculations of both major parties. The political response to the opioid crisis has been shaped, throughout its history, by a combination of genuine concern and electoral calculation that makes it difficult to assess with full confidence. The Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, passed in 2016 with bipartisan support, was the most significant federal legislation addressing the crisis up to that point, authorizing expanded treatment and prevention funding, expanding access to naloxone, and creating new grant programs for state and local response. It was notable both for its bipartisan passage and for the fact that it was initially authorized without the appropriations necessary to fully fund it, a gap that required subsequent legislation to partially address. The Support for Patients and Communities Act of 2018, another bipartisan piece of legislation, extended Medicare coverage for opioid treatment programs, addressed some of the regulatory barriers to buprenorphine prescribing, and provided additional resources for prevention and treatment. It was a genuine step forward, and its bipartisan passage in a period of intense partisan polarization reflected the unusual political salience of an issue that had produced victims in both red and blue constituencies. The federal funding for opioid response, distributed through block grants to states, through specific program funding, through changes to Medicaid coverage, increased substantially through the late 2000s and into the 2020s. The American Rescue Plan of 2021, passed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, included significant additional funding for substance use disorder treatment that states with large opioid burdens were able to deploy. The total federal investment in opioid response, measured across all programs and all years, runs into the tens of billions of dollars. Whether this investment has been adequate, whether it has been deployed effectively, whether it has reached the communities and the individuals most in need, whether it has produced measurable reductions in death and disability that justify what has been spent, is a question that public health researchers are attempting to answer, and that the mortality statistics make it difficult to answer optimistically. The overdose death rate has not fallen to pre-crisis levels. It has not fallen significantly at all in most years. The fentanyl supply continues to produce deaths at a rate that dwarfs the pharmaceutical opioid wave that preceded it. The specific political economy of the crisis has shaped the response in ways that reflect the biases and limitations of the American political system. Rural communities, which bear a disproportionate share of the mortality burden of the opioid crisis, are overrepresented in the Senate and underrepresented in the absolute dollar terms of federal program funding relative to their share of the crisis. The political salience of the crisis has been uneven, high in periods immediately preceding elections, lower in the periods between. The specific communities most affected have limited political power relative to the pharmaceutical and insurance industries whose decisions shape the availability and affordability of treatment. The criminal justice response to the crisis, the extent to which drug enforcement, incarceration, and criminal penalties for drug-related offences are part of the policy mix, has been contested throughout the crisis's history and reflects the same deep cultural divisions about addiction that shape the treatment debate. The war on drugs framing, the approach that treats drug use primarily as a criminal rather than a public health problem, has deep roots in American policy, and has been only partially displaced by the public health framing that the opioid crisis, with its initially white and suburban demographic profile, helped to normalise. The racial dimensions of the criminal justice response are significant. The policies that produced mass incarceration of black Americans for drug offences during the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s and 1990s were not applied with the same intensity to the white, rural opioid crisis of the 2000s and 2010s. The comparison has generated an important and legitimate conversation about the racial dimensions of drug policy in America, about who gets treatment and who gets incarceration, whose addiction is medicalized and whose is criminalized, whose community is served by the public health response and whose community bears the weight of enforcement. That conversation has not produced a resolution, but it has changed the terms in which drug policy is discussed in ways that may, over time, produce more equitable approaches. Chapter 14: COVID-19 and the crisis within the crisis. You're in the spring of 2020, and the world has just been reorganized by something that has nothing directly to do with opioids and everything to do with the conditions that make the opioid crisis worse. The COVID-19 pandemic arrives in the United States in March 2020 and produces a public health emergency of its own, one that intersects with the opioid crisis in ways that compound both. The specific features of the pandemic response, the lockdowns, the social distancing requirements, the closure of businesses and social institutions, the isolation of individuals from their social networks, are precisely the features that are most dangerous for people living with opioid use disorder. Recovery from addiction is a social project as much as a medical one. It depends on connection, on the relationships with other people in recovery, with counsellors and treatment providers, with family members and community members who provide support and accountability, and the sense of being known and valued that sustains people through the long, difficult process of building a life in recovery. The pandemic's isolation strips these connections from people who depend on them, and the mortality consequences are immediate and visible. Overdose deaths, which had been beginning to show some stabilization in certain states in 2018 and 2019, accelerate sharply in 2020. The CDC reports that approximately 93,000 Americans die of drug overdoses in 2020, a 29% increase over 2019, the largest single-year increase in the recorded history of the crisis. The increase is driven primarily by fentanyl, but it is amplified by the social disruption of the pandemic, by the closure of treatment programs and harm reduction services that were not equipped for telehealth delivery, by the isolation of people in crisis from the support networks that might have saved them. The pandemic does produce one genuinely positive development in the opioid treatment landscape: the emergency relaxation of the regulatory restrictions on telemedicine prescribing of buprenorphine. Before the pandemic, the regulatory requirement that patients receiving buprenorphine for opioid use disorder be seen in person for their initial evaluation was a significant access barrier, particularly in rural areas where the distance to a prescribing provider could be substantial, and where the transportation, childcare and employment constraints that affect people in early recovery made in-person appointments difficult to maintain. The emergency authorization of telemedicine prescribing of buprenorphine allowed patients to be evaluated and treated remotely, dramatically expanding the reach of medication-assisted treatment. The data on the impact of this regulatory change is, in a crisis characterized by almost uniformly grim statistics, a relative bright spot. Studies comparing treatment retention rates before and during the pandemic telehealth expansion find that patients receiving buprenorphine via telemedicine have retention rates comparable to or better than patients seen in person, suggesting that the in-person requirement was a barrier to access rather than a clinical necessity. The subsequent policy debate about whether to make the telehealth prescribing flexibility permanent, a debate that has unfolded in Congress and at the DEA over the years since the pandemic, has been one of the more hopeful policy discussions of the post-pandemic period, because it is a discussion about expanding something that works rather than managing something that is failing. The pandemic also reveals, with unusual clarity, the specific vulnerabilities of the communities most affected by the opioid crisis. The counties with the highest pre-pandemic overdose death rates are also the counties with the least robust healthcare infrastructure, the highest rates of underlying health conditions that increase COVID-19 mortality risk, the lowest rates of health insurance coverage, and the least capacity to absorb the economic shock of the pandemic recession. The opioid crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic are not parallel emergencies. They are interacting ones, each making the other worse in communities that had limited capacity to manage either. The long-term relationship between the pandemic's disruptions, the economic effects, the mental health effects, the social disruption effects, and the trajectory of the opioid crisis will be one of the defining public health questions of the decade. The early evidence is not encouraging. Chapter 15. Where things stand. The crisis today. You're in the present, as close to the present as this story can reach, in a crisis that is still generating its central chapters as these words are being written. The overdose death toll in the United States has, in most recent years, remained above 100,000 annually. The specific composition of those deaths has continued to shift. Fentanyl and its analogues remain the dominant driver, but the simultaneous presence of stimulants like methamphetamine in the drug supply and the co-use of opioids and stimulants has complicated both the clinical presentation of overdose and the public health response to it. Naloxone, which reverses opioid-induced respiratory depression, is effective against opioid-driven overdose. It does nothing for the stimulant component of a mixed overdose. The drug supply has become more complex, and the responses that were developed for a primarily opioid drug supply are imperfectly matched to the polysubstance landscape that has emerged. The settlement funds from the pharmaceutical litigation have begun to flow into state and local governments. The mechanisms for distributing and deploying those funds, the opioid abatement councils, the grant programs, the state-level decision-making processes, are in various stages of development. Whether the funds will be deployed with the efficiency and the evidence-based focus that they are theoretically required to support, or whether they will be absorbed by existing systems without producing the structural change that the scale of the crisis demands, is a question that will be answered over the next decade in the mortality and treatment statistics of the communities receiving them. The pharmaceutical industry that generated the crisis has been substantially transformed by the legal and regulatory consequences of it. Purdue Pharma no longer exists as it did. The company has been reorganized through bankruptcy into a public benefit corporation whose profits are directed to opioid abatement rather than to private shareholders. The Sackler family's name has been removed from museums and universities and cultural institutions across the world, as the full extent of their role in the crisis has become part of the public record. The major distributors have paid their settlements and implemented enhanced suspicious order monitoring systems, operating under agreements that subject them to ongoing oversight of their distribution practices. The FDA has taken steps, modest ones, critics argue, to prevent a recurrence of the specific regulatory failures that allowed OxyContin's misleading label to persist for years. The agency has revised its standards for approving opioid medications and has become more attentive, at least in stated policy, to the population-level public health consequences of opioid prescribing decisions. Prescription opioid prescribing has fallen substantially from its 2012 peak. The total volume of opioid prescriptions written in the United States has declined by more than 40% over the past decade, a reflection of changed prescribing guidelines, enhanced prescription monitoring, regulatory pressure, and the changed cultural and professional understanding of opioid risk that the crisis has produced. This reduction in prescribing is, on its face, a positive development. It also carries its own complications, including the problem of people with legitimate chronic pain who have been on long-term opioid therapy being rapidly tapered or discontinued by physicians responding to regulatory pressure, with the consequences for those patients of undertreated pain that are real and significant. The prescription monitoring programs that were largely absent in the early years of the crisis now exist in all 50 states and are significantly more functional, more timely, and more interoperable than they were a decade ago. The DEA's enforcement capacity and regulatory oversight of pharmaceutical distribution have been strengthened, though the adequacy of those enhancements remains debated. The federal and state funding for addiction treatment has increased substantially, even if it remains inadequate relative to the treatment gap. None of this has ended the crisis. The fentanyl supply has proven more resilient and more lethal than any previous drug supply challenge the country has faced, for reasons rooted in the economics of its production and distribution that are not easily addressed by demand-side interventions alone. The structural conditions that made certain communities vulnerable to the opioid crisis in the first place, the economic marginalization, the limited healthcare access, the social disruption of deindustrialization, have not been resolved. The mental health crisis that both predates the opioid crisis and is accelerated by it has not been adequately addressed. The crisis is ongoing. The emergency is not past. The 100,000 deaths per year are not a historical event. They are a present one, accumulating in real time in communities across the country, adding to a total that is already, by any measure, among the largest preventable public health disasters in American history. Chapter 16. What recovery looks like. Communities that are fighting back. You're in Huntington, West Virginia. This city has been called, at various points in the last decade, the overdose capital of America. A designation based on statistics that were real and that reflected genuine devastation. It has also been, in those same years, one of the most actively documented examples of community response to the opioid crisis. A place where the scale of the problem produced, rather than paralysis, a sustained and creative effort at response that has attracted national attention and served as a model for communities elsewhere. The Huntington response has involved the rapid expansion of a quick response team, a program in which first responders follow up with overdose survivors within days of an emergency call, offering connection to treatment and support, rather than simply recording the call and moving on. It has involved the development of a harm reduction infrastructure, needle exchange, naloxone distribution, outreach to people who use drugs, that was politically controversial in its early years, and that has built a body of evidence for its effectiveness that has reduced, if not eliminated, the controversy. It has involved the creation of a recovery community centre, a place where people in recovery can find peer support, employment assistance, and the social connection that sustains recovery, that has served thousands of people since its founding. The Huntington model is not a solution to the opioid crisis. It is a community's response to the opioid crisis, a response that has saved lives and that has built the infrastructure of a more resilient community, while the broader policy environment catches up. The mortality statistics in Huntington and the surrounding county have not returned to pre-crisis levels. The fentanyl supply continues to drive deaths. The needs continue to exceed the resources available to meet them. But the response has been real and measurable, and the knowledge that it has generated about what works, what doesn't, and how communities can build effective responses with limited resources has value beyond Huntington itself. Similar stories are playing out in communities across the country, in rural counties in Maine and Vermont that have built robust medication-assisted treatment networks reaching people who previously had no access. In urban communities in Philadelphia and Baltimore where harm reduction organizations have expanded their reach in response to the fentanyl crisis. In mid-sized cities in Ohio and Kentucky, where the combination of settlement funding, expanded Medicaid coverage, and sustained political attention has begun to build treatment infrastructure that did not exist a decade ago. The recovery community itself, the networks of people in recovery from opioid use disorder who are active in advocacy, in peer support, in the political process, has become a more visible and more powerful presence in the policy landscape than it was at the beginning of the crisis. People in recovery are testifying before legislatures, serving on policy committees, running for office, leading the organizations that deliver treatment and support services. Their expertise, the first-person knowledge of what the crisis is, what addiction feels like, what recovery requires, is increasingly being recognized as essential to designing effective responses rather than simply illustrative of the problem. This is not a triumphant narrative. The dead do not come back. The communities that were devastated over 2 decades of the crisis are not healed by the community's response to it. The grandmother raising her grandchild in Pennsylvania is not restored to the life she had before her daughter's addiction. The structural conditions that made certain communities vulnerable in the first place are not resolved by treatment programs and harm reduction services, however effective those programs are within their own scope. But the communities that are fighting back, that are refusing the narrative of hopelessness that the statistics might seem to support, that are building the infrastructure of response with the resources they have, rather than waiting for the resources they need, are demonstrating something important about what communities can do in the face of institutional failure. They are demonstrating that the people closest to the problem, with the least political power and the least institutional support, are often the ones with the clearest understanding of what is needed and the most sustained commitment to providing it. That is not nothing. In a story with as few clear heroes as this one, it matters. Chapter 17. The Doctors, Between Healer and Harm. You're in an examination room in rural Ohio. The year is 2004, and the physician sitting across from the patient has been practicing medicine in this community for 22 years. He knows most of his patients by name. He delivered some of their children. He has attended funerals for people he treated for decades, and who he could not, in the end, save from whatever it was that finally took them. He is, by any reasonable measure, a good doctor, conscientious, committed, present in a community where a physician who stays is something to be valued, because too many physicians pass through and do not stay. He is also, at this moment, sitting across from a patient who is in genuine pain, who has been in genuine pain for 3 years, who has tried physical therapy and anti-inflammatory medications and the various non-opioid interventions that the guidelines of the era recommend, and who is looking at him with the specific exhaustion of someone whose daily life is being consumed by something that nobody has yet adequately addressed. He picks up his prescription pad. He writes a prescription for OxyContin. He is following the guidelines. He has attended the continuing medical education conferences where the pain specialists, some of them paid by Purdue Pharma, though this has not been made clear to the audience, have explained that the fear of addiction has led to chronic undertreating of pain, that the evidence suggests addiction is rare in patients receiving opioids for legitimate pain, that a physician's primary obligation is to relieve suffering, and that excessive caution about opioids is itself a form of patient harm. He has read the literature, or the portions of it that have been made most visible and most accessible by the marketing apparatus of the pharmaceutical industry. He has, in good faith, updated his clinical practice to reflect what the authoritative voices in his specialty are telling him. He is not a bad man. He's a good man operating inside a system that has been deliberately manipulated to produce exactly this outcome. This prescription, written by this doctor in this examination room on this morning. The manipulation was not directed at him personally. It was directed at the profession as a whole, and it was sufficiently thorough and sufficiently sustained that it changed the clinical culture of American medicine in ways that tens of thousands of individual physicians, each making what seemed like reasonable clinical decisions in their individual examination rooms, could not see or resist. The physician as a figure in the opioid crisis occupies a morally complex position that the simple narratives of the crisis, the greedy pharmaceutical company, the negligent regulator, the helpless victim, tend to flatten in ways that do not serve either understanding or justice. The vast majority of physicians who prescribed opioids during the peak years of the crisis were not running pill mills. They were not accepting cash payments in exchange for prescriptions. They were practicing medicine in the way they had been trained to practice it, in the way the guidelines of the era directed them to practice it, in the way the medical culture they inhabited rewarded and validated. Some of them began to notice, over months and years of prescribing, that something was wrong, that patients who had been doing well on OxyContin were requesting early refills, that patients whose injuries had healed were still seeking prescriptions, that the drug they had been told was safe was producing in their patients a pattern of behaviour that looked uncomfortably like addiction. Some of these physicians responded to these observations by tapering their patients off opioids, by refusing further prescriptions, by referring patients to addiction specialists. Some of them found this enormously difficult, both clinically, because abrupt tapering of opioid-dependent patients causes severe withdrawal, and humanly, because they had developed relationships with patients over years of treatment, and now were participating in those patients' suffering in a different and more complicated way. A smaller number of physicians, the ones who ran the pill mills, who prescribed without examination, who took cash and wrote prescriptions at a rate that made any pretense of clinical judgment impossible, were engaged in something that crossed well past the line of medical practice into pharmaceutical distribution. Some of them were prosecuted, some of them had their licenses revoked, some of them cooperated with DEA investigations that produced evidence used in subsequent civil and criminal proceedings. The criminal prosecutions of physicians for opioid-related prescribing generated their own complicated moral and legal questions about the line between reckless prescribing and criminal conduct, about the culpability of physicians operating inside a system that had normalized practices that were, in retrospect, clearly harmful. The most consequential criminal prosecution related to physician prescribing is not of an individual physician, but of a corporation. In 2007, Purdue Pharma and 3 of its executives pleaded guilty to federal criminal charges of misbranding, of falsely claiming that OxyContin was less addictive and less subject to abuse than other opioids. The company paid $600 million in fines. The 3 executives paid $34.5 million in fines and were barred from participating in federal health programs. No one went to prison. The absence of prison time, the specific fact that the individuals most directly responsible for the marketing decisions that drove the pharmaceutical opioid epidemic were not imprisoned for those decisions, became one of the most contested elements of the legal response to the crisis. The $600 million fine, substantial as it was in absolute terms, was a fraction of the revenue that OxyContin had generated, and did not represent a financial consequence that would have significantly deterred a repeat of the same conduct by another company with another product. The message that the 2007 resolution sent, that the deliberate marketing of a dangerous drug with false safety claims was the kind of conduct that resulted in fines and restrictions rather than incarceration, was not the message that the scale of the harm seemed to warrant. The physicians who practiced on the border between legitimate care and harmful prescribing, the ones who were not clearly running pill mills, but who prescribed more opioids to more patients with less clinical rigor than the evidence supported, occupy the most morally ambiguous position in the opioid crisis narrative. They were simultaneously victims of a manipulation they did not fully see, and participants in the harm that manipulation caused. They were trusting the system they had been trained to trust, in a field they had devoted their professional lives to, at a moment when that system had been corrupted in ways that were visible to some people and invisible to most. What the system owed them, in terms of better information, better regulatory protection, better professional guidance, is a question that the profession of medicine has been grappling with in the years since the scale of the manipulation became clear. What they owe the patients they harmed is a question that is harder and more personal, and does not have a clean resolution. Medicine is practiced by individuals in relationships with individual patients, inside systems that shape and constrain and sometimes corrupt what is possible in those relationships. The opioid crisis is, among other things, a story about what happens when those systems fail the people inside them, both the patients and the physicians, and about how long it can take before the failure becomes visible enough to demand a response. Chapter 18. The Children, a generation shaped by crisis. You're in an elementary school classroom in eastern Kentucky. The year is 2017, and the teacher standing at the front of the room has been teaching 3rd grade in this school district for 14 years. She knows the community, she knows the families. She knew, before the academic literature caught up with what she was observing, that something had changed in the composition and the character of the children coming through her classroom in the last decade. Something that she struggled, for years, to name precisely, but that she has been living with in the daily reality of her work. The children in front of her are, by any measure, a population under stress. A significant number of them live with grandparents or aunts and uncles or family friends or in foster placements, because the parent or parents who would otherwise be raising them are not able to do so. Some of those parents are dead, some are incarcerated, some are in treatment or between treatments, or in the specific limbo of active addiction that makes parenting impossible as a practical matter, even when it remains a legal one. The stability that children need, the predictable routines, the reliable adults, the emotional availability of the people responsible for their care, has been disrupted in ways that the children carry into the classroom with them every day. The educational consequences are measurable and have been measured. Children exposed to adverse childhood experiences, the clinical term for the category of childhood stressors that includes parental addiction, household instability, loss of a parent, and the various other disruptions that the opioid crisis generates, show higher rates of learning difficulties, behavioral problems, and school absence than children without those exposures. The ACE framework, developed in a landmark study by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente in the late 1990s, established the dose-response relationship between adverse childhood experiences and negative health outcomes, including mental health conditions, substance use disorders, and chronic disease that accumulate across a lifetime. Children with high ACE scores are at greater risk for essentially every negative health outcome that can be measured. The opioid crisis has produced in the communities most affected by it a generation of children with elevated ACE scores, children who are more likely than their peers in less affected communities to experience the downstream health and social consequences of those scores. This is not a speculation about the future. It is a projection based on well-established epidemiology, applied to a population whose childhood exposures have been documented by the same public health systems that document overdose deaths and foster care placements. The foster care system has been one of the most visibly overwhelmed institutions of the opioid crisis era. The number of children in foster care in the United States, which had been declining gradually from its mid-1990s peak through the early 2000s, reversed course around 2012 and has been rising since. The increase is directly attributable, in states with the highest opioid burden, to the opioid crisis, to the removal of children from households where parental addiction has made the home unsafe, or has resulted in the death or incarceration of the parent, or has produced a level of neglect that Child Protective Services agencies have determined requires intervention. The foster care system that received these children was not prepared for them in numbers, in resources, or in the specific expertise required to support children whose removal from their homes was driven by addiction, rather than by the more traditional categories of abuse and neglect that the system had historically served. Foster families were in short supply. Therapeutic foster placements, homes capable of supporting children with significant trauma histories and developmental needs, were in even shorter supply. The kinship placements that child welfare agencies often prefer, placing children with grandparents, aunts and uncles or other family members who can maintain family connections while providing stability, strained the resources and the health of family members who had not anticipated raising children again at their stage of life, and who received less financial support than non-family foster parents. The specific condition of neonatal abstinence syndrome, the withdrawal that infants experience when born to mothers who used opioids during pregnancy, has become one of the most visible medical manifestations of the opioid crisis's impact on the next generation. Neonatal abstinence syndrome rates have increased dramatically across the country since the early 2000s, with the highest rates concentrated in the states most affected by pharmaceutical opioids. Infants with neonatal abstinence syndrome require extended hospital stays, typically several weeks of medical management, to safely manage their withdrawal symptoms. They are on average significantly more expensive to treat as newborns than infants without prenatal opioid exposure, and the long-term developmental trajectories of children with prenatal opioid exposure, which are still being studied by longitudinal research, suggest elevated risks for learning and behavioral difficulties that will require educational and therapeutic support across their childhoods. The mothers of these infants occupy a position of particular vulnerability and particular stigma in the opioid crisis. A pregnant woman with opioid use disorder faces a set of medical facts that the criminal and civil justice systems of many states have not been organized to acknowledge. Abrupt opioid withdrawal during pregnancy is medically dangerous. It can cause fetal distress, preterm labor, and fetal death. The clinically appropriate treatment for opioid use disorder in pregnancy is medication-assisted treatment, specifically methadone or buprenorphine, which maintains the mother's stability and dramatically reduces the risks of the pregnancy, while producing the neonatal abstinence syndrome that is manageable in a medical setting. In other words, the treatment that is best for the mother and the best possible outcome for the baby produces a baby who will require treatment at birth. Some states have responded to neonatal abstinence syndrome with policies that criminalize the mothers, charging them with drug delivery to a minor or child abuse, or other criminal offences arising from their drug use during pregnancy. These policies have been widely condemned by medical and public health organisations on the grounds that they deter pregnant women with opioid use disorder from seeking prenatal care and from disclosing their drug use to their healthcare providers, thereby increasing the risk of harm to both mother and baby in the name of punishing the harm the mother has caused. The tension between the public health response that the evidence supports and the punitive response that the moral and political culture of many communities demands is nowhere more acute than in the treatment of pregnant women with opioid use disorder. The children growing up in the shadow of the opioid crisis, whether they experienced prenatal opioid exposure, or the loss of a parent, or the instability of multiple placements in foster and kinship care, or simply the ambient trauma of growing up in a community where death and addiction are everyday realities, will carry the imprint of those experiences across their lifetimes. The public health implications of this are significant and long-term. The educational implications are significant and immediate. The moral implications are, in the most direct sense, a measure of what the decisions made in boardrooms and regulatory offices in the 1990s have cost people who were not yet born when those decisions were made. Chapter 19. The first responders. The people who show up. You're in an ambulance bay at 2:30 in the morning. The year is 2016, and the paramedic climbing out of the ambulance has responded to 4 overdose calls tonight. This is not unusual. In the county where she works, a mid-sized county in Ohio that has been one of the epicenters of the pharmaceutical opioid and then heroin waves, 4 overdose calls in a single shift is a pace that has become, somewhere between 2012 and the present, simply the texture of the job. Not a crisis in the sense of an exceptional event. A crisis in the sense of a sustained, unrelenting condition that has become the baseline from which every shift begins. She has administered naloxone 4 times tonight. In 3 of those cases, the person she administered it to regained consciousness and was transported to the emergency department, where they will be observed for several hours and then discharged, often without connection to any addiction treatment service, often to return to use within days, often to generate another 911 call within the week that may or may not be answered by her. In one case, she was called too late. She's not thinking about that one right now, because if she thinks about it, she will not be able to do the next call, and there will be a next call. The opioid crisis has transformed the work of emergency medical services in ways that have no precedent in the modern history of the profession. EMS systems were designed around a model of acute emergencies, heart attacks, traumas, strokes, in which the emergency is finite, the intervention is specific, and the outcome is determined by the speed and skill of the response. The opioid overdose call does not fit this model. The intervention, naloxone administration, is simple and highly effective at reversing the immediate crisis. What it does not do is address the condition that produced the crisis or prevent the next crisis from occurring. The same person, experiencing the same crisis, may generate EMS responses on multiple occasions across months or years, producing a situation in which EMS systems are delivering the same life-saving intervention repeatedly to the same individuals at significant cost without any mechanism to interrupt the underlying cycle. This mismatch between the EMS model and the nature of opioid overdose has produced several policy responses, of which the quick response team model pioneered in Huntington and adopted in various forms by communities across the country is among the most studied. The basic concept is that EMS or law enforcement personnel follow up with overdose survivors within days of an emergency response, offering connection to treatment and support services in the window of post-overdose readiness that research suggests may be a period of heightened motivation to engage with treatment. The evidence on the effectiveness of quick response teams is encouraging, though not yet definitive, and the resource requirements for sustaining them, the staff time, the community partnerships, the treatment capacity to which the team must be able to connect people, are significant. The law enforcement dimension of the first responder response to the opioid crisis is its own complicated territory. Police officers have been at the front line of the opioid crisis since its beginning, responding to overdose calls, encountering people in crisis, making decisions in real time about whether to prioritize connection to services or criminal enforcement, or simply the management of the immediate situation. The availability of naloxone to law enforcement, the decision, made by many police departments in the early 2000s, to equip patrol officers with naloxone and train them to administer it, extended the network of potential overdose responders beyond EMS and into the law enforcement officers who are often first on scene. The introduction of naloxone into policing generated its own cultural tensions. Some officers resisted carrying it, on the grounds that administering it to the same people repeatedly was enabling their drug use, or that it was not a police function, or simply that it represented a change to a professional identity organised around enforcement rather than treatment. Others embraced it, recognising that keeping people alive was the precondition for any other outcome, including recovery. The debate within law enforcement about the appropriate role of police in the opioid crisis reflects the broader societal debate about whether addiction is primarily a public health problem or a criminal justice problem conducted within the specific institutional culture of policing. The law enforcement assisted diversion programs in which police officers, rather than arresting people for drug-related offences, divert them to social services and treatment, represent one approach to repositioning law enforcement's role in the crisis. angel programs, in which people struggling with addiction can walk into a police station and request help accessing treatment, with an explicit promise that they will not be arrested, represent another. The evidence on these programs is encouraging in individual communities, and their expansion has been one of the more hopeful developments in the law enforcement response to the crisis. The fire department response to the crisis has been equally transformed. Fire departments in heavily affected communities have seen their call volume shift substantially toward medical emergencies generally, and overdose calls specifically, consuming time and resources that were budgeted based on fire call volumes that no longer reflect reality. The operational and financial implications of this shift, for staffing, for equipment, for training, for the basic organisational identity of institutions that define themselves around fire suppression, have been worked through in different ways by different departments, with varying degrees of planning and institutional support. But it is perhaps the individual first responders, the paramedics and EMTs and police officers and firefighters who have been absorbing the crisis at the most proximate level, showing up to the calls, administering the naloxone, making the decisions, carrying the weight of the dead they could not save, and the survivors they may see again next week, who have borne the human cost of the inadequate system response in the most direct and least acknowledged way. The rates of secondary trauma, burnout, and moral injury among first responders who have worked through the peak years of the opioid crisis are significant, and have been significantly under-addressed by the institutions that employ them. They show up, they keep showing up, they do the next call. That is not nothing. In a story this heavy, it is worth naming. Chapter 20. The Science of Addiction. What we now understand. You're in a neuroscience laboratory. The year is, for the purposes of this chapter, a fluid present, accumulating from the 1970s and 1980s, when the basic neurological mechanisms of opioid action were being worked out, through the 1990s and 2000s, when the specific neuroscience of addiction was becoming one of the most active and consequential fields in biomedical research, and into the present, where the understanding of addiction as a brain disease has become the dominant scientific framework, even as it remains contested in the broader culture. The neuroscience of opioid addiction begins with receptors. The brain contains opioid receptors, proteins embedded in the surfaces of neurons that respond to naturally occurring opioid-like molecules called endorphins, which the brain produces in response to pain, exercise, social bonding, and other experiences. These receptors evolved because the brain needed a system for modulating pain and regulating certain aspects of reward and motivation. Pharmaceutical and illicit opioids, morphine, oxycodone, heroin, fentanyl, act on these same receptors, producing effects that include pain relief, sedation, euphoria, and, with repeated use, the neurological adaptations that constitute physical dependence. The specific mechanism through which opioids produce addiction is centered on the brain's reward circuitry, the mesolimbic dopamine system, sometimes called the brain's reward pathway, which connects the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens and prefrontal cortex, and which is the neural substrate of motivation, reinforcement learning, and the experience of pleasure and desire. Opioids, by acting on receptors in this system, produce a surge of dopamine release that is far more intense than anything produced by natural rewards: food, social connection, sex. The brain learns, with extraordinary efficiency, that opioids produce this surge. It encodes this learning in the same neurological structures that encode all important learning, with the same molecular mechanisms but at a magnitude that normal experience does not produce. With repeated opioid use, the brain adapts. It reduces the number and sensitivity of opioid receptors, a process called downregulation, as a homeostatic response to the repeated overstimulation those receptors are experiencing. The result is that a dose that once produced intense euphoria produces less effect. Tolerance has developed. To achieve the same effect, the person must use more, and when they stop using, when the opioids are withdrawn, the brain that has adapted to the presence of opioids finds itself in a state of profound disequilibrium. The withdrawal that results is not simply discomfort. It is the physical expression of a brain trying to return to a homeostatic state that has been profoundly disrupted through a process that involves every system the opioids have affected: the autonomic nervous system, the pain system, the reward system, the sleep system, the gastrointestinal system. expressing its adaptation simultaneously in the absence of the substance that has been maintaining the new equilibrium. The craving that persists long after acute withdrawal is complete. The craving that is the most consequential predictor of relapse, and the most important target of medication-assisted treatment, is the product of durable neurological changes that the period of opioid use has produced in the brain's reward circuitry and stress response systems. The specific neural correlates of craving, the activation patterns in the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the nucleus accumbens, that are associated with drug-seeking behavior, can be measured by neuroimaging in ways that make the biological reality of addiction visible in the same direct way that the biological reality of a broken bone is visible on an X-ray. This scientific framework, addiction as a brain disease, characterized by specific, measurable, durable neurological changes that underlie the behavioral patterns associated with addiction, has been the position of the medical establishment since the American Society of Addiction Medicine formally adopted it in 2011, and before that the position of the National Institute on Drug Abuse and the broader neuroscience research community. It is a framework with significant policy implications. If addiction is a brain disease, then the appropriate response is medical, treatment, medication, the same combination of biological and behavioral intervention that is applied to other chronic brain diseases. If it is a moral failing, the appropriate response is different. Discipline, consequences, the expectation of willpower as the primary mechanism of recovery. The brain disease framework has been criticized from several directions. Some critics argue that it is reductive, that it flattens the genuine complexity of addiction, which involves social, economic, psychological, and existential dimensions that a brain disease model cannot fully capture. Others argue that it removes moral agency from the equation in ways that serve neither the individual, who does retain some capacity for decision-making, even in the depths of addiction, nor the social order, which has legitimate interests in the consequences of behavior, whatever its neurological origins. The debate is ongoing and not resolved, and the best thinking in the field is increasingly moving toward a biopsychosocial model, one that takes the neuroscience seriously without treating it as sufficient, that recognizes the biological, psychological, and social factors that contribute to addiction as interacting rather than independent. What the neuroscience makes clear is that the moral intuition underlying much of the public response to the opioid crisis, the intuition that people with addiction are simply making bad choices and that the solution is to make better choices, is not adequate as an account of what is happening in the brain of a person with opioid use disorder. The choice has become neurologically compromised in specific, measurable ways. This does not mean that choice is absent. It means that the conditions under which choice occurs have been profoundly altered by the neurological effects of chronic opioid use, and that a policy response premised on the assumption of fully unconstrained choice will systematically underestimate the difficulty of recovery and overestimate the adequacy of willpower as a treatment. The medications that constitute the backbone of medication-assisted treatment work precisely because they engage the same neurological systems that opioid users disrupted. Methadone and buprenorphine act on the same opioid receptors that illicit opioids act on, maintaining the neurological stability that the addicted brain has come to depend on, while eliminating the peaks and crashes of illicit use and allowing the person to function, work, maintain relationships, and rebuild a life. Naltrexone, a different class of medication, blocks opioid receptors rather than activating them, preventing illicit opioids from producing their effect and thereby reducing the reinforcement that drives continued use. The evidence for these medications is, as I have noted in a previous chapter, robust and long established. What has been inadequate is not the evidence but the will, the political, cultural and institutional will to implement what the evidence supports at the scale that the crisis demands. Understanding that gap between the science and the policy, between the evidence and the practice, is essential to understanding why a crisis with known effective treatments continues to kill 100,000 people a year. Conclusion. Good night. And that finally is the story of the opioid crisis, or as much of it as a single video can hold, which is to say, a great deal, and not nearly enough. It is a story that began in a doctor's office and a boardroom and a regulatory agency in the 1990s, and that is still being written in emergency departments and treatment, clinics and courthouses and county budgets and grandparents' kitchens right now. It is a story about what happens when the financial interests of powerful institutions are aligned against the health of communities, and the systems designed to prevent that misalignment fail to do so. It is a story about the specific vulnerability of communities already left behind, communities that the broader economic transformation of the late 20th century had already stripped of the industries and the opportunities that sustained them, into which a pharmaceutical crisis could pour with devastating speed. It is a story about the gap between what the science says and what the policy does, between the evidence for medication-assisted treatment and the political and cultural resistance to providing it, between the knowledge that harm reduction saves lives and the moral frameworks that resist it. It is also a story about people, about specific human beings who made decisions, in those boardrooms and regulatory offices and physicians' offices, that they knew, or should have known, would cause harm, and about other specific human beings who bore the consequences of those decisions in their bodies and their families and their communities in ways that no settlement and no congressional hearing and no documentary can fully account for. 100,000 people a year, every year. That is the scale of the ongoing catastrophe, a number so large that it becomes difficult to hold, that slips into abstraction if you're not careful, that the mind tends to process as a statistic rather than as what it is, which is 100,000 people, each with a face and a name and a family and a story that deserve to continue. I have told you a great deal tonight about systems and institutions and economics and policy. I want to leave you before you sleep with the simpler and more important thing. The people this story is about were not statistics when they were alive. They were not cautionary tales or policy problems or data points in an economic analysis. They were people. The grandmother's daughter was a person who laughed at a birthday party. The man in Kentucky in recovery is a person who is building something real. The nurse practitioner seeing patients in Huntington is a person who goes home at the end of a hard day and comes back the next morning. The story of the opioid crisis is, beneath all the policy and the economics and the litigation, a story about what happens to people when the systems that are supposed to protect them fail, and about what people do when those systems fail, which is to find each other and to build, with whatever materials they have available, something that resembles care. That is worth knowing, even at 2 a.m, even when sleep is close. If this video was useful to you, if it filled the quiet hours in some useful way, please subscribe. It means more than I can easily express. Leave me a comment telling me where you are and what time it is there. I am always moved by the distances these videos travel. Rest well. The story is ongoing. The people in it are still working. Good night.